to talk about transmedia storytelling and content planning.
Thank you, Amber. Nice to see you all today. Hope you're having fun at the conference. Forgive me, I have a little bit of a cold, so I'll be drinking water as we go through. So today I want to talk to you about transmedia storytelling and content planning, thinking like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I heard about transmedia or discovered transmedia storytelling a few years back. And I'm grew up as a huge Star Wars fan and Marvel Comics fan, reading as a kid. And I grew up in an age where you didn't talk about that. That was definitely not the thing that you shared with a lot of people. You knew who else liked it, and that's pretty much it. Today, it's fun that it's now something that's more mainstream, though my teenage son tells me that a lot of teenagers today are shutting it off because it's too mainstream. So we'll see. I still love it, and I hope you will have fun with me talking about it today, as I'm going to try to talk about what are the elements of transmedia storytelling, how it relates to the Marvel Universe, and why many of the other franchises like the Harry Potter world, Star Wars, DC, and others are trying to copy the way Marvel approaches storytelling, but hasn't quite succeeded in the way that Marvel has. So we'll get to it all today. But before we do that, I need to warn you, this presentation may contain spoilers. As at different times, I'll reference TV shows that have played even in the last week. So if you are a Marvel fan or a Star Wars fan and not caught up to date on some of the latest shows or movies, please forgive me. I may drop a spoiler here or there. Just block your ears. I'll try to remember to remind you. Okay, so what is transmedia storytelling? Let's start with that. It's the process where integral elements of a fiction get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. This is from Henry Jenkins, who has driven a lot of the conversation around transmedia as related to entertainment over the last few years. He's written several papers and books on the topic. One in particular, The Convergence Culture, talks about how the convergence of social media and all these other new platforms cause a convergence where now content can be easily shareable to everyone across multiple platforms. And this opens up the opportunity to have more of an integrated story. So let's talk about what that means in a little bit more specifics. So let's imagine you had in the good old days, you would have a movie. You might produce a video game related to the movie, and maybe there are some books written. Maybe there's the book is the movie is translated into a book, or perhaps there's additional books of stories. So back in the day, they would look something like this. They would be somewhat disconnected. The video game would be using elements of the movie, but it wouldn't be telling an additional story. It would be telling a separate story, or maybe even a completely unrelated story. And the books might venture off, like back in the Star Wars, Star Trek have both had writers write books that were not sanctioned by the companies that own those properties. And so they could write essentially whatever they want, and they didn't have to worry about fit. Now, today, we see more writing of movies and video games and books. There's a lot more of it, but these pieces are actually more complicated. And in fact, when you put them together, they actually form a synchronized or an integrated puzzle, so that stuff that's going on in a video game actually is continuing a story that occurred in some other mainstream media, such as the movie itself, or if it's a TV series or whatever it may be. And so we're seeing this convergence of this greater connection of the content, which means a lot of different things. If you're someone who enjoys it, it's an opportunity to be much more engaged and immersed. But it's also complicated because if you're trying to get into it, well, where do you begin? And that means there's also a lot of content that you could be missing potentially if it's in a media that you don't specifically enjoy. So for example, if you're not a gamer, you might miss out on a lot of good stories that are occurring in the video game related to the actual main story that you might see in a movie. Okay. So one of the key principles to transmedia storytelling that we should discuss right up front is this idea of continuity versus multiplicity. So continuity is essentially the story is continuing over time, told in multiple parts. And so if we had a one-off story, you just have a single story, so a single movie by itself. But as you have sequels, you have multiple stories along the storyline. Now, in transmedia storytelling, these stories don't have to be told in the same media. So story one could be a movie, story two could be the TV series, story three could be in a video game. So we're going to assume this could be any media. Now, multiplicity is where, so let me give you a quick example. So if we think the Matrix is the classic transmedia storytelling example. You have the original trilogy that's told across the three movies. You also had there was a Animatrix, which was the prequel to the movies that came out somewhere around when movie 2 came out. And this tells the story of essentially how the Matrix gets formed. And then there was the Matrix, the video game, and there were 2 comic book series, all of which told unique stories, but were part of the continuous storyline. So if you missed one, you were actually missing a chapter or missing a segment. Now, the movies are written in such a way that if you don't see the extras, it won't hurt your enjoyment of the movie. But if you do see the extras, you have a much more rich experience with the Matrix. Now, of course, they came out with the 4th Matrix, which is largely panned. And my honest opinion is that the directors created it as sort of pushback because the studio wanted them to create another movie and they didn't. And so you can see there's a lot of messages inside this movie that's almost making fun of the fact that they have to make a sequel. So if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching it just for that. Okay, so the other concept is multiplicity. This is where you have a single story, but that same story is retold in different ways. So there's an alternate retelling. So the classic example of this would be, say, the Iliad. You have the original book by Homer, and then there are different adaptations of it. There have been some cartoon tellings of the sack of Troy. There was a movie in the 1930s, I think, or 60s. I can't remember what year this movie came out. The Fury of Achilles, which was another telling of the sack of Troy. There have been 2 movies. There was a movie called Helen of Troy that it came out, I believe, in the 60s. And then there was a mini series called Helen of Troy that came out in the early 2000s. And then, of course, there was the disaster. I mean, I think it was a disaster. You may disagree. There was a movie called Troy, starring lots of different stars, including Brad Pitt and Orlando Bloom as the key characters, Achilles, and so not a great movie. But what these are examples of the exact same story, but different retellings of it. And so we have multiple retellings of the same thing. Now, how does this play out with Marvel? Marvel has both continuity and multiplicity. If you think about, let's take Captain America, for example. Captain America starts in the comic books, and different stories are told across different series of comic books. So we have our continuity across this one medium, and it's essentially a continuous story of Captain America. Now, if you're old enough to remember, there was a really if you're starved for content like the 7 or 8-year-old me was at that time, there was a TV show called Captain America. It was not good. But as a kid, who knew? There was also a really bad movie in the 90s. We'll talk a little bit more about why some of these things got made in the 90s. But eventually, we have the series that we know as the MCU Captain America. And there were 3 movies with the name Captain America, not including his run in the Avengers. So what does this look like? We have essentially 2 different streams of continuity. You have the comic book continuity, and you have the most recent movies continuity. But then you have multiplicity, as you have stories that come from the comic books being retold in different ways across the other media. And I'm not even including the video games and other things that come out along with this. This is just to give you a quick example to illustrate continuity versus multiplicity. So we can see this in advertising as well. When we talk about it in integrated marketing communications, but take Gecko, for example. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more. You have continuous commercials in different storylines. So you have the original Gecko, where he's the main character and going through different adventures. We have the more modern versions on the right of the screen, which would be people in these sort of anecdotal situations, sometimes not even related to insurance at all. And then you had the cavemen from the 90s. There was a whole storyline with the cavemen. And if you follow the series of commercials, it told the different stories that, getting the insurance was so easy, a caveman can do it. And these guys, of course, were always insulted. Interestingly, that series of commercials led to a television show about the cavemen, not having anything to do with insurance, but another spinoff. So we can see how a single storyline can be spun in different directions, even in advertising. Another example in advertising is BMW. BMW created a series of movie shorts directed by famous movie directors in the early 2000s, and starring Clive Owen. And the first one was The Hire. Then there was several others that many people actually have never seen. And they would air 30 seconds of the movie on television, or maybe a little bit longer. They play for maybe a minute. And if you wanted to see the full story or see the ending, you had to go to the BMW website to see the full movie. And when these came out, this was prior to YouTube being accessible and having as much content as it does today. So you really had to go to the BMW website to see a lot of this material. And you could share it, but it was a lot more difficult to share in the early 2000s compared to sharing a video like this today. So all of the examples so far, we've only talked about continuity and multiplicity, but there are other key aspects that make something successful for transmedia storytelling. And I want to discuss what those are, and then talk about some of the challenges to being good at this, and then go through some examples with Marvel and some others. So we've already talked about continuity and multiplicity. Second aspect is world building. One of the benefits to the Marvel Cinematic Universe is this massive world that has already been built in the comic books that they can draw upon. And even if you're not an avid comic book reader, this is a great deal of source material that's very rich. And so the writers for the movies and the television shows have a lot to draw upon. And as a fan, for your engagement, there's a lot of different things that you could engage with and read or watch. There's a seriality aspect to transmedia storytelling, in that you're telling stories over, say, chapters. So in the case, you think about a movie and its sequel as different chapters, but you could also think of episodic TV. Each episode is a different chapter in the story. Each comic book or each book is a different chapter of an ongoing serial or story. And so having that, and then having it across different media, is a key aspect to transmedia storytelling. The next key is drillability. And this relates to really the previous three items, in that the more that you have a great world and you have a serial nature to the storytelling, the more content fans have to drill into. And the deeper that fans can drill into it, the more engaged they are. So if it's very shallow, there's not a lot of content, but you're telling a story over multiple chapters, like we see with most commercials, well, there's only so much drillability to that. But in a lot of these big franchises, such as Marvel, DC, Star Wars, Star Trek, and others, you have a massive world. Game of Thrones would be another one. You have a massive world and massive content that exists that the fans can then dive into. And the more that there's drillability, the more effective the transmedia storytelling. Spreadability comes to how easy it is to actually spread the information. So when you see something, how quick and how fast and to how many can you spread that information to? And so if something only existed in novels, then we'd have to type quite a bit to express and share our experience of a particular novel. But when you have a television show that is a representative of the novel, like we saw with Game of Thrones, we can now link to episodes and share that with friends, or cut scenes and different things like that. So the extent that the content is shareable makes a big impact on the success of a transmedia story. And then, of course, fan contribution. What do the fans contribute to the actual storytelling itself? So this could be in the way of creating their own stories that add to the existing content. It could be in criticisms or reviews. or giving insight to some Easter eggs and things like that. And then finally, immersion. And anything that's successful transmedia storytelling offers opportunity for the fan, the follower, to be fully immersed. So, for example, having an amusement park that they can go to, or doing costume play, or buying, different things that can help you pretend to be the character in the thing that you're reading or watching. Okay. So let's talk about the MCU and apply those principles. So we saw earlier that the MCU, just with Captain America, has continuity and multiplicity. But it also has seriality as well, as the story is told over multiple chapters, both in the comic books and the movies. You have massive world building because you have all of these characters. And in the Marvel universe, you have all of these different characters all related together. And so that's a big key, because now you have a quite a bit of material that you can draw on, and people can really get into. Okay. Then we have additional content. There's been lots of books that are written. The Science of Marvel, explaining how actually the science works in Marvel. Books about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who are the originators of a lot of the content that we see. So Jack and Stan created Iron Man. They created they built up Captain America. They created the X-Men and Thor and all these characters. And then, of course, a lot of the content we see has Easter eggs, as they call them, little clues to other things, or payoffs to things that we've seen in other places, that allow greater drillability to the content. And of course, all of this now is spreadable because of the media that all of these are in. Most of the MCU it can be consumed digitally. Even the comic books now can be consumed digitally, so it makes shareability much higher. And then we have the fan contribution and immersion, and that fans are creating their own discussions, podcasts built up around talking about the material in the Marvel universe. Fans can go to the Marvel experience or a theme park. There's an experience that travels around like a convention. There's also, costume play at different conventions or at the amusement parks and things like that. So that is the strength of the Marvel universe's transmedia storytelling, in that because of the things that they do, the world building, seriality, continuity and multiplicity, and the drillability, the fans have much more to engage with and be immersed with. And so that shows how this universe has been successful. The question is, why are they successful and others are not quite as successful? Some are close and some are missing the mark. So here are some things that can break transmedia storytelling. Content and title control. And this actually was a problem for Marvel, which we'll talk about in a moment. But maintaining control over your content. Now, in the real world, businesses struggle as they license their logos and license their material to other organizations, or allow some third-party development work. And if they don't have full control, then what's being brought out, what it maybe be an extension or whatnot, or just even the use of the likeness of materials, can actually damage the brand itself, the original brand. Sorry. Then the next part is disconnect between platforms. This meaning like a disconnect between what you're producing, say, in your books versus your movies versus your television. Inconsistency of story. So now with all this serial nature of the stories, there's always the question, well, is this consistent? Is what we're seeing in chapter 15 consistent with what we saw in chapter 2? When a writer is writing a book, they have editors, and they generally are editing and re-editing and rewriting that book before it reaches the publication. So from chapter 1 to the end chapter of the book, you definitely will have consistency in the storytelling. But as these television shows and movies are made over years, and then maybe over a decade, there's a greater risk of inconsistency of the story as different people take on telling that story in different formats. And then the biggest one, in my opinion, moving forward for Marvel, as well as all the others, is the challenge of not bringing in new audiences, because eventually your audiences get older, their tastes change. We need to continually be bringing in new customers, new fans. And the longer the serial nature of your transmedia storytelling, the harder it is for new people to jump in and get on board. So let me ask a trivia question, and you can put your answer in the chat. In 2006, which of these characters was the most popular character from Marvel? This is in the comic book world, not necessarily the movie world, because in 2006, the Iron Man movie had not come out. Iron Man comes out in 2008. So in 2006, 2 years prior, when they're planning the movies, which of these 4 characters is the most popular? What do you think? I'll give you guys a moment to answer in the chat. Hulk, Spider-Man, Iron Man, Spidey, Spider-Man. All right, good. I thought, so the correct answer is Spider-Man. Spider-Man was the most popular character for Marvel, probably followed by Wolverine and the X-Men. And even maybe Fantastic Four was very popular, more popular than the Avengers and more popular than Iron Man. Yet Marvel chose as their first tentpole movie to be Iron Man. So why was that? Was that a strategic decision? Was that a purposeful decision? Did they know something about Iron Man that everybody didn't? Well, it was, believe it or not, largely a logistical decision. Because Marvel, over the years from the late 70s through the 90s, was constantly trying to get their content on television. They were trying to expand. And you'd have to reach an agreement with a studio to allow them to license and take the character for a certain number of years. And usually the agreements were such that if a studio did not produce content with that character in, say, an 8-year period, then the rights of the character reverted back to Marvel. So at the time that they wanted to produce a movie, when Disney was essentially launching the Marvel Universe, they didn't have the rights to Spider-Man. They didn't have the rights to X-Men or Fantastic Four, their other popular titles. Instead, all they had, they'd just gotten back Iron Man and Captain America and Thor, and so had to pursue presenting the Avengers. So it was interesting that now they lucked out in getting Robert Downey Jr. to be Iron Man, and that movie was an extreme success due to a lot of, great decisions in writing and other aspects. But aside from that, they were going into that knowing that this was not the most popular character. And another risk factor they had was at the time when they were filming Robert Downey Jr., he was coming off having a severe drug and alcohol addiction, and there were concerns whether he would be the right person to be the face of the Iron Man in the Marvel Universe. Turns out all decisions came up the best they could for Marvel, and the rest is history. So, key challenge for Marvel that have led to their success is getting control of the content. They acquired, so they had the heroes that reverted back to them, but they knew they needed Spider-Man, and Sony was unwilling to let go of Spider-Man because they knew Spider-Man was gold. And they had success with their Spider-Man movies, but not in the same degree that Marvel was having with the Avengers and Iron Man and Captain America. So they came to a partnership. In the case of Fantastic Four and X-Men, Disney eventually acquired 20th Century Fox. And so that allowed them to now bring this material in, and we're going to see over the next few years an introduction of these characters. We've already seen Mr. Fantastic in the latest Doctor Strange movie. There you go, spoiler, sorry, forgot the warning. There's one more interesting agreement that's out there, in that technically Universal Studios owns the rights to the Hulk. So that's why Marvel can't make a separate Hulk movie. We've seen a separate movie for almost all the other original 5 characters under the MCU. There was a Hulk movie with Ed Norton in 2008, but that's not largely loved. It's still considered part of this canon, but they can't make another Hulk movie because of the agreement they have with Universal. They can only use Hulk in other movies. So a key to Marvel's success, getting control of the content. The other issue they had was, at one point in time, Marvel TV was a separate organization from the movies. And as much as the TV content that was being created, like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the stuff on Netflix that was really loved, well, maybe just Daredevil, or Jessica Jones too. But these were largely disconnected, and the movies did nothing to try to integrate or keep the connection between the television and the movies, which was problematic because for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., for example, due to the elements that occurred in the Captain America movies, it pretty much destroyed the reason for having S.H.I.E.L.D. And so there was a problem. It was creating much more discourse, making it much more difficult to have the fluidity for transmedia storytelling. And so when Disney finally launched Disney Plus, they brought the movie and the TV houses together under one leadership. And as a result, now you have a great number of TV shows being created specifically for Disney Plus, and it's interconnected with the movie. So we now have it's not like a multiplicity issue. We have more continuity and more ties to the original storyline. And interestingly enough, they're going to start reintroducing many of the Netflix shows, in particular Daredevil, because it did so well and fans want it. This is not unlike what we talk about in integrated marketing communications and making sure that we have integration across our different marketing tools. And so what we saw in Marvel before was a lack of integration, and now we see greater integration. Now, a couple of examples of some problems where things have fallen out. Game of Thrones, just give me a quick yes or no. Fan of Game of Thrones, the HBO series, yes, no? In the chat, yes, yes. So Game of Thrones was a massive, you haven't had time. Well, this is definitely binge worthy. Okay, a few people haven't seen it, my goodness. Well, spoiler alert a little bit. It was a great series. What was interesting though, one of the challenges was that the author had not finished the story. So it's based on George R.R. Martin's books that are all, as you can see in the pictures, very dense and take some years to write these books. And there's been large gaps between the books. Everybody who's a fan is awaiting book 6 out of 7. And let's just say the last book came out in 2006 or I think 2011 was the last book. So everybody's been waiting for that next book, and it's not even the last book, and it's been over 10 years. And several people are convinced he's never going to write it. Why am I telling you this? Is because this became an incredible hit on HBO, but around season 7 of the hit series, they ran out of the original content. So great world building, massive world that the author had created, but incomplete. And so the showrunners had to essentially create their own ending based on outlines and notes from the author. And many people argue that they rushed the last season. And so the last season has been panned by many fans, and largely because the fans were let down by expectations that have been built up. And so you have to be very careful about how the fans are treated with the seriality of these stories and disappointing them. And the other issue being that now we have a multiplicity issue, where before the TV show was pretty much lockstep with the books. While it's still a different retelling and there are changes made, we have probably a larger change that occurs with that last season to where the books are going. Well, we don't know yet, but that's what everybody suspects is happening. And nobody knows when that book is coming out. So one of the things that Marvel has tried to do is they've tried to reduce the impact of multiplicity, and they're trying to reconnect all of the content that they have so it's streamlined into one single story. So in 2 new movies that came out in the last 6 months, Spider-Man No Way Home and Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, introduced this concept of the multiverse. And basically this means that we have multiple mirror universes where things happen differently. And so there's a you in every other universe, but your life is different across these different universes. There's a great, I think it's Michelle Yeoh came out with a movie recently tackling the same topic in a one-off movie. So in Spider-Man, they connect the modern day Spider-Man to the prior two actors who played Spider-Man for Sony in the early 2000s. And it was great. And for fans, this was a great fan service, but they did it in a way that was true to the content. And so it was believable and enjoyable. And then it continues in the multiverse of madness with Doctor Strange, as he now, in this movie, they specifically placed where does the movie universe live relative to all the other multiplicity universes, such as the comic book universe and others. So now we can, as a fan, and much like when you design a syllabus for a course and you have a structure of where everything fits, as a fan, we can see where all the different things fit. So if you liked the movies made by 20th Century Fox for the X-Men, or you didn't like them, at least we know where they fit in this new universe. And that helps fans understand the content, and again, drillability and embracing and immersion. Now, the good and bad, though, of all of this content is that over time, you have a lot of content. There's 23 Marvel movies to watch now. I'm glad I watched them when they came out, because that would probably take someone all summer long to get through it. And since summer is starting, maybe it's a good time for any of you who have not got on the bandwagon yet. So there's even debates, and this is again where fans jump in with their own connection and contribution, and what's the right viewing order to watch the movies. So is it better to watch them in the release order or in chronological order based on what year they take place, since they do take place in different points of time. And of course, what's the hook to bring in new fans? How do we bring in people who have not been part of the initial run of these movies, either younger people who are just old enough now to start watching, or others who put it off and maybe didn't see a reason to jump in, or also to keep the fans who have been with it for not giving up and saying, well, we've seen it all already. You know, how many times am I going to see the hero's journey in these movies with just a different character? And so if you notice in looking at what Marvel has done in the last few years, they've now gone and tried to create, in addition to maintaining the primary storyline, which we see in the established heroes like Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, they're releasing other movies that are part of the same timeline, but you can watch and enjoy them without ever seeing the other movies. And they also are targeting new audiences and diverse audiences. So we have Shang-Chi, which was a movie that came out last fall, and Shang-Chi with the main character being Chinese. And so this is a big change from all the other characters. And what's great about it is that the original comic book Shang-Chi has a lot of bad stereotypes, and they were able to, I think, do justice in this movie, correcting a lot of the errors of the 1970s comic book. But what's interesting is that now we have these 3 other TV shows, not movies, so where they are going in a slightly different direction. Instead of making a massive movie that may not be successful on a large audience, and the cost of making a large movie, they're essentially making these mini movies in the way of a 6-episode TV show. And these TV shows are also going after diverse and new audiences. So for example, Moon Knight going and explaining, going after audiences that might be concerned about a character that has a personality disorder. Miss Marvel is the first character on television and in the movies that introduces an Islamic or Muslim character in the Kamala. And the show is fantastic, and talking about growing up and what it's like to grow up as a Pakistani girl in New York. And then another show is coming out featuring a female lead, is She-Hulk. And what's going to be different about this show is that it's going to be like the Deadpool movies, in that they're planning on breaking the fourth wall. And having a female lead with a very strong female character. So what's interesting is that, in a sense, Marvel is using these TV shows to educate audiences about different social issues and challenges that exist in our world today, while in the context of these superheroes. All right, so we're going to wrap this up and hopefully allow for a few minutes of questions. Other movie universes have struggled to replicate what Marvel is doing. They've come close, they've tried, and they've not failed, but struggled. And so some examples, often that's because they either lack vision, too complex, they don't have the same world building or the fan interests, or the storylines either don't honor the original content or they get lost. So one example, the Dark Universe. Universal tried to reintroduce the Mummy, and they had intentions of bringing in all the monsters, and the Mummy did so poorly that that universe was never to be spoken of again. But real quick, because I also love DC, I usually, when I teach class, I teach with a mask that has Batman all over it. One of the issues with DC is they've lacked patience and the vision. Marvel patiently built up to the Avengers over multiple movies. They didn't rush it over 2 years. They took several years to build up to a team up movie, whereas DC tried to jump into it quickly with new versions of these characters that people had not fully embraced yet individually. So they didn't really take advantage of the world building that had existed for DC, and they largely ignored a lot of the source material or adapted it in a way that they thought it was gritty and the way audiences would like it. And then they have a television world that's largely disconnected, that's nicely interconnected within it, but disconnected from the movie universe. But of course, with this whole multiverse thing, it's all connected in some way. But in large ways, they put the cart before the horse in terms of trying to be like Marvel before they built up the connection with the audiences. Now, I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. There's lots of books. Maybe let me know if you're a Harry Potter fan in the chat. But the original movies were largely very good. You know, we can argue over what was left out of the books and what should have been in the movies, but largely people love the movies and they're very good. And you have an opportunity for immersion in the Harry Potter world down in Florida. I highly recommend it. This is my family geeking out as a Harry Potter family. And we all got placed in a different house. But unfortunately, the Potterverse is hitting some tough times as they've introduced these new movies, the Fantastic Beasts movies, which have not been well received, and largely due to J.K. Rowling not having an editor to really help her figure out how to write these movies. She's writing a movie for the first time, and the story is very disjointed at times. Not only that, she's disrupted her own timeline. There are inconsistencies now that Fantastic Beasts create that are not supported by the Harry Potter books. And of course, you've got the trouble with actors, Johnny Depp, and his recent squabbles with his ex-wife, Amber Heard, and JK herself also getting into trouble with many of the things she said on the internet. And Star Wars, which is my personal favorite. Star Wars, I love, grew up with Star Wars, big influence in my life. And Star Wars has done something different from everybody. When Disney purchased Star Wars, they essentially erased all of the content that had been created other than the movies and said anything that was created before we took this over, we're going to call it Legends. It doesn't exist in the main storyline. And everything that we're creating from here on exists in the main storyline. So now when you watch a cartoon, play a video game that's been created since the 2002, I think, or 2003. So video games, comic books, TV, everything, it's an interconnected storyline, which is wonderful. Makes it fun, lots of stuff to drill into. So there's a lot of good things, but it also makes it more complex. And because of this lengthy storyline, it's a lot harder to manage. You need a full team to manage that storyline. And when they brought in J.J. Abrams, they for some reason didn't have a vision and did not manage that storyline. And he and the other directors were allowed to create stories that weren't necessarily supported by all the rich material that had come before, making a divide in the fans. The fans were angry because they're like, this is not realistic, or this is not consistent. And you've got those who love JJ and those who don't. And I'm in the those who don't camp. Sorry, everybody. But I'll say that if you're watching the new TV shows, I love them. Mandalorian, Boba Fett, and now Obi-Wan, really getting us back into what Star Wars should be. And a nice fan service in the recent episode of Obi-Wan, Darth Vader pulls down the ship as it's trying to take off and makes it crash. And this is a callback to a video game that they created before Disney, where the character in it does the exact same thing. And it's just, you can see I'm gushing. All right, we're going to wrap this up. So everyone wants to be connected to Marvel. We now see John Krasinski from The Office as Mr. Fantastic. And this is something the fans have been calling for. Daniel Radcliffe from the Potterverse may actually be Wolverine. Oh my goodness, we'll see, but people are talking about it. So what we can all take away from it, other than we don't listen to Scorsese, is that transmedia storytelling does not need to be film excellence. It's not about the superiority or the beautifulness of the one film to make it like The Godfather or other, great films in the history of filmmaking. It's more about the world building and the strength of that context that people can immerse themselves into. Transmedia storytelling works when we have the large world, the seriality, the multiple pieces of content, and things that we can dig into and lose ourselves in to enjoy that sort of total overall experience. And that's my presentation. I'd love to chat more about this. In the words of Stan Lee, Excelsior.
Rich, thank you so much. What an awesome presentation. I am a really big fan of the MCU and the new Star Wars TV shows. So this is a great presentation for me. I would love to hear everyone else's feedback in the chat. I appreciate you so much for being here, Rich. Today we can hang on for a couple more minutes, see if anyone
Sure.
has any questions. Maybe we can talk a little bit about, I know this is kind of a new study that you're doing for your upcoming semester. So if you have any kind of tips on how any of our attendees can kind of incorporate these references into the classroom, that'd be great.
Well, so I'm trying to build them. So you saw I'm trying. So first, this is sort of my dream of, I'm finally going to do some research that I am actually passionate about. So there's two thoughts. Is one, students I found, and especially I have two young kids who I watch in their learning process, but sometimes students who may not find an interest in a particular topic might be lacking the right motivation. And so, for example, kids who might find certain topics in history to be really boring find history to be more exciting when they see a presentation like one of the movies, if it's a good telling of the Iliad. There's, I forget the name, there's a video series that tells, I think it's Sarcastic Productions on YouTube, tells some great stories, factually correct, accurate historical tellings, and it can get kids into the topic area, unlike a lot of textbooks. And so to some extent, telling a story about the content we're teaching can be a gateway for students who might not like the subject to suddenly take an interest and then want to dig in deeper. So you could look at the way transmedia storytelling is being used in education is to find different ways to present the same content to allow a different gateway for a student to access that content and get interested. And then once they're interested, they'll drill into the other content that's available, even some of the stuff that's dry, because that interest has been sparked. So I think if you're thinking about this from a teaching perspective, try to find videos, other things that might engage students that to create that initial spark, and then follow it up with some traditional content. From a research perspective, I'm trying to find some of the explanations for why fans get immersed. There's a rich research in this area already, so I'm hoping to just simply explain why Marvel is successful at it and others are not, and looking at the brand and financial implications of these franchises who use transmedia storytelling.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rich. I will be looking forward to reading about your research when it's ready to come out. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Rich, thank you so much for all the great insight you provided to us during your session. I hope everyone here got a lot out of that and really enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope to see you at our final keynote of